Bears can strike anywhere. Raging rivers, tundra, or quiet villages. Imagine a rifle jamming before a charging Alaskan grizzly, backpackers mauled in Maine, Russian officers torn apart, or a caretaker betrayed by his own bear. From a polar bear ambush in Norway to a Kodiak tearing through a village store, safety can vanish in an instant. In this video, we'll uncover 6 shocking true stories of bear attacks that will leave you stunned. On August 17, 2025, the steep walls of a remote Alaskan canyon echoed with the rush of salmon forcing their way upstream. It was the height of the run, and countless fish leapt and shimmered against the current. Along the bank stood Marcus Lee, a 42-year-old wildlife photographer known for chasing dramatic scenes across some of the world's harshest landscapes. He had dedicated years to documenting the raw power of nature, often venturing into areas where few dared to travel. His work had earned recognition, but also came with constant risk. To him, carrying a rifle was as essential as carrying his camera, for he knew the predators that shared the wilderness were as unpredictable as the weather. Marcus was not alone. A fellow traveler had joined him to assist with equipment, helping carry lenses, tripods, and protective gear along the canyon floor. They moved carefully, setting up near a curve where salmon gathered in pools. Marcus adjusted his camera, waiting for the right moment to capture the burst of silver bodies as they leapt against the falls. He had worked in dangerous places before, photographing lions in Africa and wolves in Canada, but the Alaskan backcountry always carried a sharper edge. Here, one misstep could mean disaster. The canyon seemed quiet, aside from the roar of water and the click of his camera. Yet unseen in the dense brush along the slope, a massive grizzly stirred. The animal, easily 1,500 pounds, had followed the scent of fish and the sound of movement. Hunger and instinct drove it closer, silent until the final moment. When it burst through the greenery, the ground seemed to tremble beneath it. Marcus swung for his rifle, heart hammering. The bear thundered toward him, closing the distance in seconds. He raised the weapon, braced against the recoil, and fired. The shot cracked across the canyon, but in his panic, the bullet only skimmed through the thick fur of the shoulder. The giant barely staggered. Snarling, it came harder. He tried again, struggling to steady his aim as the beast surged closer. The second round hit lower than intended, grazing its flank and fueling its rage. The grizzly roared, foam at its jaws, and slammed into Marcus with crushing force. He was thrown to the ground, air knocked from his chest. Pain ripped through his ribs as the full weight of the animal bore down. Claws shredded the fabric, tearing into flesh. His camera bag was flung aside like a piece of paper. On the rocky floor, Marcus struggled beneath the brute's strength. The sound of his companion banging metal gear echoed against stone, the sharp noise slicing through the chaos. The bear's head turned, distracted for an instant, its rage divided. That moment gave Marcus a chance. He rolled desperately toward a rocky ledge, battered and bloodied, dragging himself upward while clutching the rifle. His chest heaved, his vision blurred, but his finger found the trigger once again. With a calm born of pure survival, he steadied his sights on the advancing bulk. The next shot rang out, straight and true. The final round struck deep, echoing across the canyon as the massive shape jolted backward. The predator staggered, its chest heaving, and with a guttural roar it twisted toward the tree line. Muscles rippled as it limped across the brush, each step shaking branches until its hulking body vanished into the dark edge of the forest. Silence followed, broken only by the river's endless crash and the wheeze of Marcus's breath. He slumped against the rocks, chest rising and falling with painful effort. His ribs screamed with every breath, his back throbbed from the crushing blow, and his clothing hung in tatters. Blood soaked into the gravel, mixing with the spray from the falls. His companion climbed carefully to his side, eyes wide with shock, hands trembling as they tried to pull scraps of torn fabric into makeshift bandages. Marcus's face was pale, but his eyes remained fixed on the shadowed trees where the bear had disappeared, half expecting it to return. Time moved strangely in the aftermath. The roar of the water seemed louder, the canyon colder, the wind sharper against skin. Every scrape and laceration burned. He tested his arms and legs, forcing movement despite the pain. The broken ribs made it hard to breathe, but standing was possible. The thought of staying in that canyon weighed heavily. An injured man surrounded by blood and scattered gear was an invitation for another attack. Together they gathered what little could be salvaged. The camera lay cracked on the ground, lens shattered beyond repair. His tripod was twisted, and several bags had been torn open by claws. The rifle, streaked with blood and dirt, was the only piece of equipment still functional. With effort, they packed what remained, leaving behind wreckage as they began the long trek out of the canyon. Each step was agony. Marcus leaned heavily on his companion, his body stiff and unsteady. The trail back wound through slippery stones and thick brush, the memory of the charging grizzly fresh in every sound of breaking twigs. They spoke no words, only pressed forward, each movement fueled by urgency and survival. By dusk, they reached a clearing where a radio was stashed for emergencies. Fingers clumsy from shock and pain, his companion managed to send a call for help. Hours later, rescue crews arrived, headlights cutting through the night. Marcus was lifted onto a stretcher, ribs bound, wounds cleaned and wrapped. The ride out blurred in his memory, broken by flashes of pain and the distant thought of what had nearly happened. Doctors later confirmed several fractured ribs, deep lacerations across his torso, and bruising that would take months to heal. Weeks passed before he could stand upright without pain. The photographs he had taken that morning were lost, but the memory of the encounter burned sharper than any image. News of the attack spread quickly, a reminder shared among hunters, travelers, and photographers alike. In Alaska, even the strongest rifle means little if panic aims, and a moment of hesitation can decide life or death. Marcus survived, scarred and wiser, carrying proof that in the wild, preparation is never enough when instinct and raw force rise from the shadows. On July 14, 2025, the quiet backroads of western Maine stretched beneath tall pines and shadowed hills. Along a lonely highway sat a small wooden bus shelter, weathered from years of snow and rain. It was here that Maya Sullivan, 27, and Ethan Parker, 30, waited after days of trekking through the wilderness. Both were seasoned backpackers who valued adventure over comfort. Maya had grown up near the coast, where hiking trails and cliffside walks had shaped her love for the outdoors. Ethan, stronger and broader, had once worked as a guide in the Appalachian Mountains, carrying years of skill and endurance. Together they had traveled across many trails, but this stop in Maine was meant to be a pause between journeys, a place to rest before heading home. Their gear lay scattered around the bench, backpacks bulged with snacks, water bottles, and worn camping tools. The air carried faint scents of dried fruit and granola bars, scents that traveled farther than either had realized. The forest around them felt calm, with soft breezes rustling through the leaves and the faint hum of insects hidden in the brush. They relaxed, unaware of the silent movement in the tree line. From the shadows, a black bear prowled forward, its body heavy with muscle, its nose twitching at the smell of food. The predator had likely been roaming close to the road in search of scraps before encountering a stronger scent. It crept closer, silent at first, before stepping into the open with a suddenness that froze both travelers. The bear's dark frame loomed as it charged. In seconds, it covered the space between the trees and the shelter, its claws scraping against the dirt. Ethan stepped forward instinctively, trying to grab his pack, but the animal was quicker. With one swipe, its paw raked across his shoulder and upper arm, cutting through fabric and skin with shocking force. Blood spread down his sleeve as the weight of the blow knocked him back. Maya's scream pierced the stillness. She grabbed her jacket and waved it, desperate to draw the bear's attention away from Ethan. Her heart pounded as she pulled him behind the wooden bench, their only shield against the advancing figure. The bear growled deeply, pacing toward them, its head low, teeth bared. Every movement felt endless. The wooden shelter shook as claws raked against its frame. The backpacks ripped open, food spilling onto the ground as the predator pawed through the supplies. The sharp smell of sweat and blood excited it further. Growls filled the air, deep and threatening, as the animal fixed its gaze again on the trembling pair. Maya gripped Ethan's arm, pressing her jacket against the wound while holding her ground. Her voice carried no strength now, but her movements never stopped. She kept waving fabric, trying to appear larger, fighting panic as the bear's massive body lunged closer. The dark shape towered, its paw lifting high above the bench. In that moment, the roar of an engine shattered the silence. The sudden roar of the engine cut through the night air as headlights swept across the shelter. A truck barreled down the lonely road, its horn blasting in one long echo. The noise and lights startled the predator. Its massive frame flinched, its head snapped toward the road. With a final growl, it turned sharply and bounded into the thick undergrowth, snapping branches as it vanished into the forest. Silence returned just as quickly, leaving only the fading rumble of the truck and the sound of ragged breathing from behind the bench. Maya lowered her arm slowly, her jacket still clutched in one hand, her body trembling with adrenaline. She leaned against Ethan, who sat slumped against the wooden frame, blood soaking his torn sleeve. The attack had lasted only minutes, yet it felt like hours carved into memory. Around them, shredded backpacks lay scattered, food spilled across the dirt floor of the shelter, and claw marks gouged deep into the wood. Ethan pressed his free hand against his injured arm, his breath short and uneven. Pain ran across his chest with every movement, but he forced himself to stay upright. Maya tore strips from her jacket and wrapped them tightly around his shoulder, doing her best to slow the bleeding. Her own arms shook from the effort, though she fought to keep her focus. The bus stop, once just a roadside shelter, had become a battlefield marked by blood, mud, and claw. The night dragged on slowly. Every sound from the forest felt like a threat. Twigs cracking, leaves rustling, even the cry of an owl made their hearts pound. They knew the animal could return, drawn back by the scent of blood or scraps of food, and neither dared to rest. Instead, they stayed close together, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the tree line. When the first light of dawn stretched across the horizon, the forest revealed the full extent of the damage. Wooden boards were splintered, food wrappers and broken gear lay scattered in the dirt, and streaks of dried blood stained the bench where Ethan had fallen. The peaceful bus stop looked more like the aftermath of a storm than a waiting place for travelers. By mid-morning, another vehicle approached, and the driver stopped when he saw the injured pair. Help was called, and soon Ethan was transported to a nearby town where doctors cleaned and stitched his wounds. The cuts were deep, but they had avoided worse damage. Bruises and scars would remain, reminders of how close the encounter had come to ending in a different way. Maya, though uninjured, carried her own marks in the form of trembling hands and restless nights. In the days that followed, officials returned to inspect the area. They warned that food odors had likely drawn the predator and urged travelers never to leave supplies exposed. For Maya and Ethan, the lesson was not only carved into words, but also into their skin and memory. The wilderness had shown its power, and they had survived by chance and noise alone. On August 10, 2023, the wide rivers of the Amur region flowed under heavy skies, their waters swollen from recent rains. Along these lonely banks, patrol boats often carried men tasked with guarding supplies and watching for smugglers. Among them were two officers, Dmitry Volkov, aged 44, and Yuri Belov, aged 39. Both men had served for years in harsh conditions. Dmitry was broad-shouldered, a veteran of river duty, known for his calm under pressure. Yuri was younger by a few years, leaner and driven by fierce loyalty to his comrades. Together they had built trust through countless journeys along these isolated waters. That morning their boat carried crates of provisions meant for remote checkpoints. Food, fuel, and tools were stacked neatly in the vessel, the air thick with the mixed scent of smoked meat and fuel oil. The river wound its way through a thick forest, where dense alder and birch pressed close to the banks. It was a place of raw wilderness, home to predators that moved unseen in the shadows. Few patrols passed without sighting fresh tracks in the mud or hearing the distant calls of unseen animals. As the boat pulled against the current, the officers stopped along a shallow bend to stretch and check the load. Their colleagues secured ropes and rattled containers. The air was quiet, except for the rushing water. None of them noticed the hulking shape moving silently in the tree line. A Russian grizzly, drawn by the strong smell of food, had been circling the river's edge, its hunger sharpened by lean months of scarce prey. Its bulk shifted through the brush, eyes fixed on the men. Without warning, the predator charged. Branches snapped as the great body surged from cover, paws pounding the earth. Shouts erupted across the riverbank. Officers scrambled to raise flares, sparks hissing into the air, but the bear pressed forward, undeterred. Its first strike crashed into Dmitry, sending him sprawling into the rapids. Water splashed high as claws raked across his torso, tearing through uniform and skin alike. The river's roar swallowed his cry. Yuri rushed to his aid, seizing the nearest tool at hand, a long metal pole used for pushing the boat. He swung with desperate force, striking the animal across its flank. The blow barely slowed the charging beast. With one massive swipe, it struck him down, the weight of the impact breaking bone and spilling blood across the stones. Colleagues banged metal containers, their voices hoarse from shouting, trying to draw the predator's fury away. Sparks from another flare sizzled through the mist, but the animal's roars drowned everything else. The scene descended into chaos, wood cracking beneath its weight, water churning with every desperate movement. For long minutes, survival seemed impossible. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the grizzly hesitated. Its head lifted, ears twitching at distant sounds from the forest. With a low growl, it turned, vanishing into the thick brush, leaving destruction in its wake. The forest grew quiet once the grizzly vanished, but the silence carried no peace. The river ran red where Dimitri's body floated in the shallows, his uniform torn and soaked. His colleagues rushed to pull him from the current, dragging him to the bank with desperate hands. The wounds across his torso were deep, blood flowing faster than their makeshift bandages could contain. Beside him, Yuri lay motionless, his frame broken where he had fallen. His face was pale, his chest still, his weapon lost in the mud. The men called for help, their shouts echoing off the valley walls, but no answer came except the steady rumble of water against stone. Time slowed into long moments of fear and grief. The patrol group gathered, trying to comfort one another while keeping watch on the tree line. Every snapping branch made their nerves jolt. The thought of the grizzly returning hung heavy in the air, pressing down harder than the storm clouds above. They piled their gear close and kept flares ready, their eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The minutes stretched into an hour, and with it came the weight of reality. Dimitri's breath grew faint, each gasp weaker than the last. They tried to carry him to the boat, but the loss of blood had already drained his strength. His head fell back as his final breath left him. The patrolmen froze, their hearts sinking as they realized they had lost not one but two comrades to the sudden fury of the wilderness. The survivors sat in stunned silence. The river that had always felt like a lifeline now seemed cruel, its waters carrying away the last warmth of their fallen friends. The crates of supplies still rested in the boat, untouched, the very scent of them having lured the predator that ended two lives. Each man understood in that moment how fragile their own existence was, and how quickly duty could turn into tragedy. When reinforcements arrived hours later, they found a grim scene. The battered shelter of gear, the bloodied earth, and the still forms of the officers told a story no report could soften. Bodies were carefully lifted, wrapped in blankets, and placed in the boat. Their colleagues stood in silence, heads bowed, while the river carried them downstream. Word of the attack spread quickly across the Amur region. Officials warned that shrinking food sources and human encroachment were forcing bears into bolder, more dangerous encounters. Hunters and patrolmen alike were reminded that even experience and preparation could fail when facing such raw force. In small villages, families whispered the names of Dimitri and Yuri with sorrow, honoring their service while grieving the cost. The river continued its endless flow, carrying memories of the day when a routine patrol turned into a fight for survival. For those who lived through it, the scars were not just on their skin but in their hearts. The loss of two trusted men became a reminder that in the wild reaches of the Amur, duty always carried a shadow of risk, and nature's power could never be underestimated. On August 21st, 2025, the Alaskan wilderness lay quiet beneath tall spruce and sharp peaks, where a small wooden cabin sat hidden in a valley few ever visited. Inside lived Gunnar Eriksson, a 41-year-old caretaker with a reputation for strength and patience. He had devoted years to the work of raising animals, believing that creatures left abandoned or wounded deserved another chance. His most daring project had been the raising of a brown bear, taken in as a cub after being found alone in the brush. Over seasons, Gunnar fed, sheltered, and studied the animal, convinced that trust between man and beast could be built with consistency. Working alongside him was Annika Sorensen, a 36-year-old assistant with a steady temperament and a deep respect for wildlife. She had grown up in northern lands herself, where life with snow and predators demanded resilience. Together they managed the secluded site, far from towns where the sound of running water and the calls of distant birds filled their days. The bear had become the focus of their labor. What had once been a vulnerable cub was now a towering creature, massive and powerful, weighing well over 1,000 pounds. Though it had always shown a measure of calm around them, there was no denying the size of its teeth, the length of its claws, and the raw force that lived within its body. That morning began like countless others, with Gunnar preparing food near the cabin while Annika organized supplies inside. The valley air was crisp, and the bear moved restlessly outside, shifting its weight and pacing across the ground with heavy steps. Gunnar stepped forward, carrying the familiar scent of meat and fish. The bear's head lifted, and its dark eyes fixed sharply on him. For an instant, the calm they had come to trust seemed to falter. Then, with terrifying speed, the animal lunged. The ground shook under its charge as claws swept forward, raking across Gunnar's chest and shoulders. The strike threw him hard against the wooden floor, pain flooding his body as ribs cracked beneath the blow. His breath escaped in a sharp gasp as blood spread across his clothing. The bear loomed above him, its growls rattling the walls of the cabin. Annika, hearing the crash, rushed to act. She grabbed a metal bucket and pounded it against the wall with desperate force, the clanging echo ringing through the room. The sound pulled the predator's attention for a moment, giving Gunnar a chance to crawl backward across the floor, his arms shaking with weakness. Yet the bear's rage had not passed. It circled, snapping its jaws, knocking over shelves and scattering supplies across the room. Furniture splintered under its weight as it slammed against walls, gouging deep marks into the wood. Every second stretched like an eternity. Gunnar tried to push himself upright, but searing pain shot through his chest. His escape was blocked as the bear prowled in front of the doorway, its massive form cutting off the only clear route outside, the air filled with dust and fear. The cabin was no longer a place of safety, but a trap with death closing in. The massive bear prowled near the entrance, its growls filling the cabin as it shoved aside broken chairs and scattered containers. Gunnar lay on the floor, his chest heaving, every breath sharp with pain. The deep cuts along his torso burned while blood soaked through his clothing. His strength was fading, and every small attempt to move sent waves of agony through his ribs and muscles. The wooden planks creaked under the shifting weight of the animal as it turned, eyes flashing in the dim light. Annika stood frozen for a moment, clutching the dented bucket, her heart pounding louder than the echoes of the metal she had struck. Her body trembled, but she forced herself forward, kicking at the scattered supplies to make noise. The sharp clang of falling pans rang out, and the bear swung its head toward her. For a dreadful instant it looked ready to charge again, its jaws snapping in the dust-filled air. Then, with a guttural sound, it moved back toward the wall. It slammed its shoulder against the timber, leaving claw marks as deep as knives before finally shifting its bulk toward the doorway. The heavy body pushed through the opening it had torn earlier, crashing into the cold air outside. Snowmelt dripped from the eaves as silence slowly returned. For long minutes, neither Gunnar nor Annika moved, listening for any sign of its return. Only the fading growls from the valley told them the animal had gone. The cabin was left in ruin. Broken shelves, shredded blankets, and scattered food filled the small space. The wooden walls bore long gashes where claws had ripped through the grain, a reminder of how thin their barrier against nature truly was. Gunnar tried to sit up, his face pale from blood loss. His side was swollen, the deep wounds across his shoulders raw and open. Annika rushed to his aid, wrapping cloth around his injuries, her hands shaking as she pressed down to slow the bleeding. The hours that followed stretched endlessly. They had no quick way to summon help, only basic supplies stored in the damaged packs. Annika lit a lantern and worked to clean the wounds as best she could, using the little antiseptic they had. Gunnar drifted in and out of consciousness, groaning as pain spread through his battered frame. The smell of torn food lingered, sharp and heavy in the air, reminding them that the bear could return if hunger drove it close again. By the next morning, the valley was quiet. Annika stepped outside to look for tracks and found deep prints leading toward the river. The beast had moved on, but the damage inside remained. She built a small fire, both to bring warmth and to keep any other creatures away. The flames reflected off the scratched walls, their glow a fragile defense against the wild that surrounded them. When officials finally arrived, word spread quickly. Many shook their heads at the risk of raising such a predator, reminding all that even years of care could not tame instincts carved by survival. The valley carried scars, but none deeper than those left on Gunnar, who now understood that trust with such creatures could vanish in a single breath. On February 21st, 2024, the white expanse of the Svalbard archipelago stretched for miles under a heavy Arctic sky. In that frozen isolation, a temporary helicopter camp had been set up to support supply runs between distant outposts. The camp was simple but functional, with a cargo helicopter parked near stacked crates, tents for workers, and toolboxes lined along the ice-crusted ground. Among those stationed there was Leif Johansson, a 42-year-old field engineer. He had grown up with a fascination for machines, spending his youth repairing small engines before moving on to aircraft. His life had led him north, where few others dared to work, his skills vital for survival in places where any failure could mean death in the cold. Leif was known among colleagues for his calm focus. He had left behind a small family in Tromsø, promising them he would be careful in the harsh conditions of the north. To him, the Arctic was both a challenge and a duty. Every bolt tightened and every rotor checked carried the weight of keeping others alive in a place where storms and thin ice already posed constant danger. That morning, with temperatures plunging far below freezing, he worked steadily on the helicopter, moving slowly to ensure nothing was overlooked before takeoff. Around him, his team busied themselves with loading gear, their breath visible in the brittle air. Unseen to them, danger crept closer. The sea ice had been thinning that season, forcing predators inland in search of food. Across the snowfields, two polar bears moved silently, their massive paws pressing deep into the drifts. Hunger sharpened their movements, their gaunt frames blending with the pale landscape until they seemed like part of the wind itself. Leif bent low by the skids of the helicopter, checking hydraulic lines. The world felt quiet except for the crunch of boots on ice and the faint rattle of tools against metal. In that stillness, the sudden attack was a blur of raw power. One of the bears lunged from the snowdrift, its bulk crashing forward in an explosion of force. Before Leif could react, it struck with a massive swipe that knocked him against the helicopter's landing gear. The impact crushed air from his lungs. Claws ripped through his heavy Arctic jacket, slicing into skin beneath layers meant to protect against cold, not predators. The bear's jaws clamped around his torso, the pressure of bone-crushing strength squeezing through layers of insulation. His cry was drowned by the roar of the animal, which shook him violently before dragging him several meters across the snow. His colleagues reacted in frantic desperation. Toolboxes clanged as men banged them together, trying to make noise that might scare the predator. Bright flares hissed into the sky, their red sparks lighting the storm-filled horizon. Yet the bear held on, its hunger stronger than fear of fire or sound. The snow turned red as Leif's body slid across the frozen ground, his movements weakening with every second. The chaos unfolded in minutes, yet to those watching it seemed to stretch into eternity. The helicopter loomed uselessly above the scene, its steel frame trembling as the bear slammed against it. Around them, the Arctic wilderness seemed endless, a vast and merciless stage for a struggle between man and predator. The flare smoke drifted upward, glowing against the dark Arctic sky as the camp erupted in panic. Men shouted, their voices carried away by the icy wind, while metal clanged again and again in a desperate attempt to drive the predator back. The polar bear dragged Leif across the snow, his body limp against the ice, blood streaking across the white surface. Each step of the beast pressed deep hollows into the frozen ground, leaving a path of destruction across the camp. Another flare hissed through the air, landing close to the bear's flank. The burst of sparks startled it just enough for its grip to loosen. With a guttural growl, it released Leif, retreating several paces while keeping its head low and eyes fixed on the group. For a moment, it circled in the drifting snow, pacing slowly as though weighing whether to continue the assault. The engineers banged tools against metal crates until their hands ached, the sounds echoing across the barren expanse. Finally, the bear turned away, retreating into the pale curtain of snow. Its hulking form faded slowly into the whiteness until only silence remained, broken by the sharp hiss of the final flare burning itself out. The men rushed forward, pulling Leif away from the blood-stained snow, their gloves slick with crimson. His breaths were shallow, his chest crushed and torn from the weight of the jaws that had held him. They wrapped him in heavy blankets, their hands trembling as they tried to stop the bleeding. The helicopter, which he had been preparing only minutes before, now became his only chance of survival. The team scrambled to load him inside, the rotors spinning into the frigid air with a deafening roar. Snow whipped around them in violent circles as the machine lifted off, leaving behind the camp marked with claw scars and shattered crates. The flight to the nearest outpost felt endless. The cabin shook with the force of the storm outside, but inside it was the sound of labored breathing that filled every moment. His colleagues pressed cloth against his wounds, whispered prayers under their breaths, and willed the distance to close faster. Yet when the helicopter finally touched down at the medical station, the damage had already gone too far. Despite rapid efforts, his injuries were beyond repair, the crushing force of the attack having shattered ribs and torn through vital organs. When the news spread, shock rippled across the remote settlements of Svalbard. Leif had been known as a careful worker, steady under pressure, never reckless with his duties. To many, his death became a grim reminder of how fragile human life remained in a land ruled by cold and hunger. Officials arrived at the camp days later, studying the deep tracks and the claw marks carved into the helicopter's landing gear. They warned that shrinking sea ice was forcing predators inland, stripping them of their natural habitats and driving them closer to human camps. The memory of that day lingered with every worker who had been present. The sound of growls, the sight of claws raking through insulated gear, and the helplessness of watching a colleague being dragged across the snow stayed in their minds. The Arctic remained vast and beautiful, but it had shown once again that survival there demanded constant vigilance. Even the strength of machines and the shelter of camps offered no certainty when hunger pushed a predator into motion. On June 18, 2021, in a remote Alaskan settlement surrounded by thick spruce and endless tundra, a small store stood as the lifeline for the people who lived there. It was the place where families came for food, supplies, and news from neighbors. The owner, Tobias Kane, was 52 years old and had spent his life in the north. He had inherited the store from his father and had kept it running through storms, shortages, and long winters. For him, the building was more than a business. It was a piece of history and a symbol of survival, representing the community's ability to endure far from cities and roads. Tobias was known for his steady nature, his grizzled beard, and his hands worn from years of lifting crates and repairing broken fixtures. His store had survived earthquakes and blizzards, and he often said it would outlast him. On that summer day, he prepared for the evening rush of neighbors arriving to collect their goods. Beside him, a single customer browsed the aisles, unaware that danger was moving closer through the forest shadows. The summer had been warm, and food scraps left unsecured had attracted wildlife. Outside the village, a massive Kodiak bear roamed, gaunt from long days of foraging and emboldened by the smell of human stores. The predator followed the scent that drifted on the wind, carrying it straight toward the settlement. The store's wooden frame, though solid against storms, was no defense against what was coming. The first sound was a heavy thud against the front. Tobias looked up, puzzled, before the true force arrived. With a deafening crash, the Kodiak burst through the entrance, smashing the door and sending shards of glass spraying across the floor. Shelves rattled as the beast surged forward, its bulk filling the space with terrifying speed. The customer froze, then stumbled back as crates toppled in every direction. Tobias grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a chair, and tried to shield himself. The bear swung its paw, the blow splintering wood and leaving deep scars in the counter. Merchandise scattered as boxes of food split open, filling the air with sharp smells that only fueled the animal's frenzy. The aisles became chaotic. Displays were overturned, cans rolled across the floor, and the ceiling lights flickered as if the building itself trembled in response to the attack. Every step the beast took left gouges in the floorboards, its claws tearing apart supplies that had taken months to stock. Tobias barely dodged one swipe that cut through the wall behind him, the strength of the strike strong enough to split the paneling. For several minutes that felt like hours. The bear prowled inside, knocking over tables and clawing at anything in reach. The destruction absolute. The village store, once a quiet refuge, had become a battlefield under the weight of the Kodiak's rage. And as Tobias stood cornered, the sound of approaching engines signaled that help was near. But the terror inside the store was far from over. Engines roared closer as headlights cut through the dim evening outside the shattered store. The Kodiak lifted its head, ears twitching at the noise, but it was not yet ready to leave. It prowled between broken aisles, its hulking body brushing against shelves that collapsed under its weight. Glass crunched beneath its paws, and every movement sent more goods tumbling across the ruined floor. Tobias pressed himself behind an overturned counter, his breath ragged, watching the beast stalk the space he had tended for decades. The single customer crouched near the back wall, trembling as the bear sniffed and rumbled through the wreckage. Both survivors knew that one more sudden move could draw its fury again. The chaos of smashed crates, spilled food, and clawed wood made the building feel smaller with every step the animal took. Its sheer presence dominated the room, leaving no corner safe. Then the doorframe rattled again, this time with the arrival of local authorities. Boots stamped against the ground as men rushed in with rifles and flare pistols raised. They fired warning shots that echoed across the valley, the sound sharp and piercing in the night. The bear turned sharply, huffing as the flashes of light and thunder of gunfire filled the store. For a long moment, it held its ground, glaring at the intruders with eyes full of defiance. At last, the massive animal backed away, swinging its head side to side before lumbering through the gaping doorway it had created. Its outline faded into the tree line, swallowed by the dark forest, leaving only destruction in its wake. Relief washed through the building, but it was heavy, tangled with fear and exhaustion. Tobias stood shakily, blood dripping from cuts where flying glass had torn his skin. The customer followed, his hands trembling as he pushed aside fallen boxes. The aftermath was grim. Deep gouges marked the counters, walls, and shelves. Whole sections of the store were flattened, supplies crushed beneath the beast's weight. The floor glittered with shards mixed with food and spilled drinks. Hours of sweeping, lifting, and repairing would not erase the scars left in minutes. Neighbors soon gathered, their faces pale as they stepped through the wreckage. Many had relied on this store for their meals, and now it stood barely functional. Officials took notes, warning the village that poorly secured food had likely drawn the animals so close. They urged stronger storage, reinforced doors, and constant caution. For Tobias, the loss was more than supplies and broken walls. It was the shattering of a place that had carried his family's history, turned into chaos in a single evening. Though no lives were lost, the memory of claws tearing through his livelihood would stay with him. The warning was clear to everyone in the settlement. In Alaska's wilderness, even a single mistake could invite disaster, and every structure was only as strong as the will to defend it.